of being a student at the Instituto Cultural in Oaxaca, Mexico. I spent 4 hours a day in intensive language school. And during that time, there we go. My focus was learning Spanish, but my thoughts, as they often do, turned to the teaching and learning of mathematics. So I'm going to share with you 10 lessons that I learned while I was a language learner. So the first lesson that I learned, this will probably resonate with some of you, is just because I know it today doesn't mean I'll know it tomorrow. Many times I would be sure I had something figured out, and then the next day or even after the break, it was as if someone had tipped me over and it just fell right out of my head. Couldn't remember a thing. This is another one. There were lots of times when it looked like I wasn't listening because I wasn't. I was thinking. I was processing what we had just talked about, what I had just figured out. I was also trying to figure out what I was going to say or do next. The next thing is I knew exactly where I stood in the class. I knew that Soren, the dude in the middle, he was the highest student in the class. I was probably the worst. The teacher didn't make that apparent, but I knew that where I stood. Part of that had to do with this one. Fear of not knowing was my enemy. When the teacher would ask a question like, do you have any pets? I said, sí. Nothing more. Now, you all know, if you know me, you have heard about Maisie and Buster. You have seen pictures of Maisie and Buster, but I wouldn't talk about them. But when Soren would ask the same question, sí. And then he says, oh, how do you say fish? And the teacher said, here's how you say fish. Oh, do you have a fish? And then he said, yes, I have a fish. All in Spanish. He got all of that extra time with the teacher. So here's the next one. Even when I know the content, that academic language was really hard. This was particularly evident in the area where we're all pretty comfortable. Things like the counting numbers. You will see from my notebook, I had to take very, very particular notes. And if somebody said, how do you say 7? I was like a preschooler, and I just, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, oh, siete, right? So even when I know the content, here's my dictation. Now, the good news is I only got 1 wrong out of 20, so that's not terrible. But you can see it was so hard for me to translate that content that I know really well, but translate from the Spanish to the English and then write it down. Here's another one. Pressure makes it really hard to access what I do know. Things like, ¿cómo estás? ¿Cómo se llama? I know those. I know what that means. I know how to answer. But in the moment, I would be terrified and my mind was blank. And then words like this, right? We all know these words. We live in California. I could not remember the word for water, right? Or a table. It was gone. Here's another one. Knowing how to do school helps, but it wasn't enough. So here, I had my notebook, I got my colored flags and my pencils. I also know that to answer what's on page 15, I just have to look at page 14. I'm really good at doing school stuff, but that bookwork could give a real false sense of my competence. My teacher might say, well, she's doing great, A+. I felt about as competent, though, as little dead pedo over here. So another thing I learned, context clues matter. We were playing a game where I had a name on my forehead, and I was trying to think of who's the white actor. He's 40-ish. He was in a movie with Kate Winslet about a plane wreck. I couldn't, for the life of me, figure out what movie that was. Duh, it was a shipwreck. As soon as I figured out shipwreck, of course it made sense. Leonardo DiCaprio. Those context clues make a big difference. So here's the good news. My 10th lesson I learned is that those strategies that we've all heard about, we all try to use, they work. I was in 4 hours of intensive Spanish. I'd never taken Spanish before, but because my teacher used these strategies, I was able to understand most of it. Repetition, the use of pictures, making those connections. Also, her patience was such a huge part of helping me learn to begin to understand and speak Spanish. So here are my 10 lessons. I've kind of flipped them to think about them from the perspective of your students. So especially those kids that you don't hear from, those kids on the margins, those kids who haven't yet found their voice. Hopefully these ideas will help you figure out how to better support them. So with that, I'm done. I say gracias y adios.